I'm Dave Greenwood, and this is Overcoming Distractions. If you are an adult with ADHD, a busy professional, an entrepreneur, a high achiever, or just need some strategies to navigate your adult ADHD, you're in the right place. Who am I? I'm an entrepreneur with ADHD and the author of 2 books, Overcoming Distractions and Overcoming Burnout. I coach and mentor people just like you, and together we navigate the ups and downs of adult ADHD. From getting out of our own way to helping people just like you thrive in the workplace. That's what I do. Want more info on working with me? Hit overcomingdistractions.com. Ready? Let's get to today's podcast. All right, gang, what's going on? It's Overcoming Distractions. We're back. I don't know if I took a week off or not. I can't tell. Well, if I did, I apologize. And if I didn't, then hey, we're here. So that's what's important. So, all right, we are talking about various strategies and methodologies for managing and thriving with adult ADHD. And we have Jeff Copper back from Dig Coaching. If you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, you know that we do have a conversation 2-3 times a year on various subjects of your interest. We dig in a little bit. We have some aha moments. Would that be correct, Mr. Copper?
Well, that's what I'm kind of all about, the ahas. Trying to look at things differently and see things that you didn't see before. So, yep.
No, and I think that's what people like about this podcast, and
Yep.
we've gotten some great feedback about your conversations on here
Thank
as
you.
well. And I always get people saying to me, you know what? There's no BS when you guys talk. It's just you just get down to business. It's street
Yep.
smart. There's no kind of hocus pocus. So and that's what I like about you, because we kind of dig in and rip the
Yep.
Band-Aid off, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we're talking about various ways that can support an
Yes.
adult with ADHD. I know different people need various supports depending on where they are, their mindset, the struggles, life events, that type of thing. There could be as much as therapy, seeing a psychologist. There could be a mentor,
Yep.
things in between. So, but can you go through some of the more popular and even in your experience, maybe effective ways
Sure.
that professionals have supported adults with ADHD over the years? Yeah.
I think the number one that we start at the beginning, that's education. I was interviewing a Dr. David Teplin one time about people that don't get diagnosis, and he had made a comment. It's hard to treat something if you don't really know what you're treating. So a lot of times it's to get an education on what your diagnosis is and comorbid conditions so that you understand what you're dealing with. There's a lot of information, best practices out there, at least to kind of to get you on board. So that's fundamental. I think that's kind of across the board. Then there's Brett Thornhill. Years ago, I was interviewing. He's a very clever guy. He was a coach, and he talked about non-med meds. Okay. When working with people, I think about your brain as you have the physical brain, and then you have like the more mental side. So like you have the hardware of the computer, that's the machine. The mind is like the software, and both of those have to be running in harmony in order for you to achieve your mission. That's a kind of taken from David Gore. And when we talk about the non-med meds, they're really about the machine, trying to make sure your brain is working optimally. Because if you've got a motherboard or a processor in your computer that are not working optimally, the software can't run well. Yeah. So the non-med meds are meditations. It begins with that, right? Meditation is sitting there, or mindfulness, where you're focused on an object, your breath in the present. Most people think of like meditation as this Zen-like thing, but it's actually not. When you're sitting there and you're noticing your breath and your mind wanders, you're supposed to notice it and bring it back to your breath. It's like an athlete doing exercises so that you're present with your presence in the present. So your mind, you're actively trying to watch your mind and bring it back. It's difficult for people with ADHD to practice mindfulness or meditation, but all the experts I've ever talked to just think it's absolutely wonderful. So that's the first. The second is exercise, right? I was interviewing Dr. John Rady one time, and he said if we could put exercise in a pill, it would be the ADHD drug of the century.
Oh, yeah.
It can normalize so many things. In fact, there's probably a dozen people that I've interviewed that didn't get diagnosed until like they either got an injury or were in an accident and could no longer exercise. So there's a lot of people that actually self-medicate with that.
Hmm.
Next would be diet, right? Number one, diet, what you put in your body is important, but also more and more, I'm finding in my practice, a lot of people that have very mild gluten sensitivities, and that exacerbate ADHD symptoms. So diet's a part of it. And then sleep. There's a lot of people with ADHD, or a lot of people out there that have sleep apnea and often get misdiagnosed with ADHD because the symptoms of sleep deprivation look very similar to ADHD. So when you go out on the internet, there's a lot of stuff that's about these, and I will acknowledge these are spectacular. It takes a little bit of self-regulation to adhere to them, so they're not as easy to execute, but it's definitely an area to focus on. So then we have that. Next would be regular medications, right? Stimulants and some of the non-stimulants if you can't. And, the research suggests that those are some of the most positive interventions. And we go back with stimulants. I think they started in 1937.
Mhm.
I'm not a medical doctor or anything, but I have heard Dr. Ned Hallowell many times. So, if you use stimulants under the care of a physician, they're safer than aspirin.
Mhm.
If that's true or not, I don't know, but I'll leave that to him. I'm just parroting him. So those are the basics, but then we start to adding help. And this can take many different forms. There's traditional therapy, which is really helpful for some, particularly those who have had some trauma in their life. There's some level of working with people with ADHD that if there's some traumatic events, that can really have a underlying effect on other interventions. So if you've had some, that therapy is really, really important. Then we start moving into more behavior type stuff, cognitive behavioral therapy or behavioral coaching. And behavioral coaching, or I'll also take to a certain extent executive functioning coaches, where they're teaching skills. They're trying to condition your behavior to conform to something in order to get an outcome. And I want to kind of stop here and pause is that we are really cognitively illiterate when you think about it. It's human nature to make observations using our senses, and we judge a lot of times ADHD based off the behavior we see. If a person's not doing maybe what we think they should do, we will say that person is unmotivated or lazy, which is not an accurate observation, which I'll get to in a minute. But needless to say is we make observations with what we see, and we're cognitively illiterate. So a lot of the interventions that we have right now are really to change habits or conform in some way to get to an outcome. And I want to pause here, behavior is definitely changeable. You can take your dog to dog training class and train the dog to heel and sit. You can train human beings to behave in a certain way. But as I've learned over the years of studying Dr. Russell Barkley's model, ADHD is actually an executive functioning impairment.
Right. Yeah.
Impairments are really not changeable. Like my eyesight is impaired. I need an accommodation for my eyesight for me to achieve my potential. And so, to a certain extent, impairments actually impact behavior. So, of the therapies, the cognitive behavioral therapy, the behavioral coaching, and some of the executive function coaches, they're teaching behavioral skills. And the success, in my opinion, has been limited at some level because it doesn't accommodate like the underlying impairment. Okay, but we do it because it's kind of the best that we have right now. So the other intervention I want to talk about here is it departs from that a little bit, is more the life coaching, the ADHD coaching that's really coming from True Life Coach, where you're trying to work with the individual on a creative basis, understanding the clients or the person's created naturally sourceful in the whole, and work with them to maybe try to figure out ways to kind of work together. So I kind of want to pause and kind of get your thoughts on what we've talked about so far. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, what I have found, and I think you would agree that you mentioned medication, and you're right. Both you and I are we should stay in our lane when it comes to the medical world,
Yep.
right? You know,
Yep.
but um, some people I know that I've worked with one-on-one, they got their diagnosis, they got medications, maybe they had to, it was a little trial and error, whether it was timing or adjustments or maybe even a completely different medication. And yes, I would never tell somebody that that was the wrong approach.
Mhm.
Um, what I do know and what I tell people when we initially see if I can help them is I tell people I work on the mechanics
Mhm.
of your ADHD. I don't think medication, and I don't think a therapist, as you mentioned, is going to work on the mechanics. Maybe somebody has an enormous workload that they're trying to figure out how to get done, how to prioritize.
Mhm.
Maybe they have absolutely no semblance of a
Mhm.
to-do list,
Yep.
or they're not structuring their week in a way that actually allows them to work with the energy
Yep.
rather than fight it. You know what I
Yep.
mean?
Yep.
Perfect example is, look, I can kick ass from 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. and then my brain shuts down, those
Yep.
types of things. So I think a medication and a therapist would not probably be equipped to solve those problems, and that's where a coach or a
Yep.
mentor comes
Mhm.
in to really kind of dig into the
Mhm.
nitty gritty. Would you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this is not really fair, but it's an overgeneralization. But the therapy side is really very much about the emotional side. Coaching is really more about, okay, given that we're waking up tomorrow, what do we do? Type thing. Like, kind
Yeah.
of roller
And I
coaster.
also think that um, a fair amount of people have come to me that are burned out.
Hmm.
Um, and that's where I also say, look, again, we can work on the mechanics.
Yes.
I mean, in overcoming burnout, I say we're co-founders of our burnout. Yeah,
Yep.
you may be in a situation where the workload is just ridiculous and the
Yep.
culture is to the point where there's things you're not going to change. There's the
Hmm.
things you can control, but also, as you say, there could be years of chronic stress that
Yes.
again maybe a therapist or a
Yes.
psychologist is the best person to kind of piggyback off those
Absolutely.
types of things. So you got to work out the stuff that
Yep.
maybe um, has been plaguing you is the wrong word,
Yep.
but bothering you over the years,
Yep.
and then we really need to figure out how
Yep.
to get get
Absolutely.
get your shit together when it comes to your weekly schedule. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
so that's what I
Absolutely.
would say about those is um I think for somebody who's really struggling or challenged with ADHD as an adult, I think a team effort
Yep.
I think would work
Yep.
well.
Yes.
Yeah,
And what they say a multimodal approach where you're taking stimulants and coaching or therapy or something, that combination is really kind of the best across the board. Pills don't teach the skills, if, as they say, and sometimes it's just rounding everything out is really kind of appropriate. So
yeah,
the thing about everything thus far, again, is we've been doing these interventions have been based off of kind of what we can see because we really haven't had much more technology.
yeah,
So one of the things that was interesting to me years ago is I was at a conference and there was a guy got up as a keynote speaker and he basically said, our knowledge of ADHD has increased substantially in recent times, but our interventions really haven't kept pace.
mm,
I thought that was kind of a profound statement, and over the years, I've been really grateful to you because you've allowed me to come on and talk about some things like, as we say, we get down to the dirty. We did a show together on working memory some time ago, and I was kind of breaking it down and according to Dr. Russell Barkley's model to kind of like help people begin to understand like maybe underlying issues, the root cause of some problems. Because I talk a lot about how much of procrastination is rooted in ambiguity. If you don't really know what to do, then you escape to something else. So,
no, and I
well,
think my one of my favorite words is clarity. It is
yes,
whether it is whether it is the paper you need to write for your boss, whether it's the project you
Yes.
need to finish, whether it's your entire um, job description.
Uh-huh.
Okay. When, as you say, there's ambiguity or a lack of
Yep.
clarity. The thing that gets in my craw, I'm going to talk like my father, about like procrastination, is there's so many, I'm just going to say there's a lot of knuckleheads out there on
Yep.
social media giving not only
Yes.
misinformation, but I think
Yep.
dangerous, you
Yes,
know.
I agree. There's another thing with that too, is that people buy easy, and so there's this incentive for people to dumb it down. But needless to say, what really kind of was grateful to come on, because I've actually developed something I like to think it's revolutionary, and it's a program called cognitive ergonomics from the inside out. And let me explain. Engineering is a field that's designed to solve problems. Systems engineering is a field that designs systems and organizes.
Right.
They kind
Yeah.
of support everything else. And there's a field under that called ergonomics. It's about fitting the job to the person. So, if you've got a chair, you have an adjustment so you could get it to fit somebody who's 4 foot tall or somebody who's 7 foot tall. But the idea is you fit the job to the person to increase productivity, um, also to reduce stress, and for health reasons.
Yeah.
Because if you're sitting in a chair that's not appropriate, it can create a lot of problems. And the world's really pretty advanced when it comes to ergonomics in the physical world, but it's quite primitive when it comes to cognitive ergonomics. And in order to have any field of engineering, you first have to have some type of model that defines what you're doing and has repeatable patterns that's explained by the model. I've been on with you. I talk endlessly about Dr. Barkley's model of ADHD as an executive function impairment, and I think it's brilliant. When you understand it, and most people think of executive function as a collection. It's a collection of mind tools that you use to problem solve. And the mind tools are used individually and collectively, and sometimes they actually conflict with each other. So I've taken his model, and over the years, I've developed something called attention scope. In trademark it. It's a collection of simulations and experiences that I put people in to bring tangibility to executive function. So when we did the working memory show, we did a little exercise where I asked you to repeat 6 words back to me in alphabetical order. And if you recall, you struggled with that a little bit. And the point wasn't to get it right or wrong, but to actually say, you had to load information, you had to manipulate those 6 words into alphabetical order to solve a problem.
I can tell
That,
you that those situations cause me instant anxiety.
yep. Yeah, well, so that the instant anxiety is the emotional reaction, which is an executive function. And so attention scope is this tool that I've used because we talk about executive functions, but when I put people in it and you can begin to recognize them as they unfold in real life, we now have a model and we now have a means for people to begin to see executive functions and tangibility. And with those two, we can now use a Six Sigma approach to problem solving.
Hmm.
All right. It's number one, define the underlying problem and then the root cause. And here's the key: to accommodate the impairment. We're no longer focusing on you changing your behavior to get to an outcome. It's about accommodating the thinking process to get to the outcome. It is like it's the equivalent to moving from the world is flat to the moving world is round. It's a titanic shift in how we approach everything. And it's been fun for me because, again, we're cognitively illiterate. We couldn't do this before because we didn't have the model and we didn't have the technology to do that. I put together 3 pilot programs of this and tested them, and I've been elated. It's cut my coaching time by 60% for some people. Now, this isn't for everybody, which I'll explain in a minute, but the idea is you sit, and once you understand executive functions, you take a look at whatever you're not doing and you say, what's hard? That's a diagnostic question for you to identify the relevant variables, which are more cognitive than they are behaviorally. And then when you solve for the problem. So you and I have talked about a lot of times procrastination is rooted in ambiguity. And a lot of the current tips, tricks, and strategies are to chunk it down or do it in sprints and stuff like that, which really make a lot of sense. But if what the program that I have is reveals all kinds of insights that are invisible. For example, people come to me all the time and I say most of procrastination is rooted in ambiguity. Yeah. And they go, well, if you chunk it down, is that a way to remove the ambiguity? And I go, well, yeah, but it doesn't work. And people get confused by that.
But
And
there's
I go,
also the scenario where, as you say, ambiguity. So I have to finish this project for my boss. Okay. Sure, you can say chunk it down, but what if you don't know what to chunk down? What if you're
yep,
missing pieces? What if a coworker owes you a piece of the project
yep,
and you don't have it? Now this piece is missing and you
yes,
can't even chunk it down.
yeah,
And now you're afraid to actually go and ask that coworker because you've already goofed off on the project and now you're
yep,
embarrassed to
yep,
actually ask them for that.
yep.
Is that correct?
Yeah, so I love how we work together. So let me kind of finish what I was saying and kind of go into what you're doing.
I
Is
interrupted Jeff
no,
again.
no, 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 no. You're because you're leading me into where I want to go. Is that the trick really is people don't realize ADHD is really more of a thinking in your head as to problem solve
Yeah.
impairment. Now, judging, daydreaming, and learning is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about where when I gave you those 6 words and I said, I want you to repeat them back to me in alphabetical order, it's very goal directed. The problem with it is chunking it down. People go back to their office or school and they sit and they try to do it in their head. That's what is impaired. So it doesn't work. It does work when you're with somebody collaborating with them. That's the accommodation.
Yeah.
And so what the model begins to do is when you understand it, you begin to see with clarity. Yes, ambiguity requires a lot of cognitive thinking. When cognitive thinking is really heavy, it's heavy, it's uncomfortable. It takes a lot of cognitive energy to sit in pain, so you escape. The idea is you've got to address and make the thinking part easier. And so for the first time, we actually have a science, if you will, to walk in and identify this is the core impairment. The accommodation is the person needs to be able to collaborate with somebody to move forward.
Mm.
Up to this point in time, we didn't have really anything to back up that. We emotionally began to think I should just be doing by myself. But now, if you go through the program, you begin to understand it and you realize it and you can perform very well. So now we have the ability to go advocate. A student might need to have the ability to talk through something with a teacher, or an employee might need to be able to talk through things with their boss. People with ADHD are really as intelligent as anybody else, but sometimes they need these accommodations. And what's been fun in the program that I've done is we are unearthing all kinds of things that are cognitive accommodations that are not addressed in the business or school world. One of the things that's kind of complicated, but toggling is really a working memory nightmare when you're trying
Yeah.
to move from screens and because your working memory capacity is small. Nobody's really, again, had the technology or the wherewithal to walk in and not only say this is an issue, but define it in such a way that engineers and stuff would do something about it. So I'm excited to announce it. It's a new methodology, again, because we never had the tools that we needed to do this. So again, it's no longer about structure. It's about providing accommodations to the way your brain works so that you can do it in a most natural way. So I've been doing a lot of talking, so I kind of pause here for a second. Other than that, when you said, hey, I don't really even know where to break it down, that accommodation is the ability to go talk to somebody to break it down, because there's a huge correlation between clarity and motivation.
So could you provide a kind of a brief scenario, say in the workplace, a busy professional with ADHD, a brief scenario that listeners could relate to as to how this methodology uh, is implemented
Yeah,
in their
okay.
lives? Yeah.
So this is a true story, and I'm gonna say it, and I'm gonna say most of your listeners are gonna have a really strong emotional reaction to this. So I'm gonna ask you to let me get through the explanation of
Mm-hmm.
it. Then we'll explain what this is all about. I'm coaching an individual that does digital marketing in another country, and they're working by themselves. And pretty much their day is I mean, they have no social life. It's doing everything they can to get through it. And I'm working with the individual, they've got ADHD, and we started talking about their nonverbal working memories impaired. Basically, it's self-talk. And that when they're talking out loud to other people, or they're talking to other people, a lot of times what it looks like they're talking, they're really thinking out loud to themselves and they solve problems. And the person begins to buy into the concept a little bit. Um, and I'm really encouraging them, like, you need to get contact because they're working virtually. So one day, we come to a call and this person's stressed out, but they took on another job. And I said, well, what did you do different for an accommodation? And the person's like, what? I said, yeah, I mean, we've learned a lot about your ADD. It's impaired, and not to talk is not to think. What did you do differently now in order to resolve that problem? And they were dumbfounded. She said, like, what do you mean? Like, what you could do is, in contracting with them, you have the terms and the agreements and what they're going to pay you, but you contract in, like, meet with you and your staff Monday, Wednesday, Friday from noon to 1:30. I can cancel, you can't, no negotiation. Now, she was floored by this. Like, I can't do that. And I was like, well, you cannot do it and suffer, or you can do it and resolve the issue. And a lot of people out there might like, I can't do that. Like, I really kind of can't do that. Well, we never really had any kind of backing to say that's a legitimate request. Well, to my surprise, because I really didn't think that she would do it because she was, emotionally august, but she actually went back to them and said, listen, I sent you the wrong contract by mistake. She sent it back and it was written in for the agreements and they signed it without even batting a word. Now, here's the point. If we don't have a way of legitimizing the need for that accommodation, it's very difficult for people to ask for it. Like, if somebody is in a wheelchair, it's really clear that they need a ramp, right? They build that in, that's an accommodation. We haven't had something that brings tangibility to executive functions to begin to say for the first time, these are actually reasonable accommodations for people with ADHD. So cognitive ergonomics from the inside out is in its primitive stages, but for the first time, I'm hoping to be able to train people in this, which I'll explain in a second, so that we can actually change the world of accommodations to accommodate for this impairment. Now, as an aside, the program I had to develop because attention scope is a complicated lens. So the way to understand it is a radiologist has to go through special training to become proficient at reading CAT scans, MRIs, ultrasounds, X-rays, right? It's not like you can just look at it and know what you're looking at. You have to go through specialized training to know what to look for. Attention scope is kind of the same way. You got to go through specialized training in order to understand what you're looking at. And so what I'm hoping is to be able to begin training people on this, because the program is not for just people with ADHD. It's very helpful, but this is for therapists, it's for coaches, it's for teachers, it's for parents, it's for literally everybody to bring tangibility to it. And so I'm getting the word out to people and starting to train people on its methodology. And I have to tell you, I've been really excited. The therapists that have gone through the program, it's like, oh my God, this has completely changed their understanding of what's going on. And so my hope is, while I'm starting my program, it's the beginning of a new era and a new intervention to help those with ADHD, and actually take this to the corporate world and to schools to say, no, you can't have people toggling. Kids in school, when they go on to their grades, they're toggling all over the place. That is a working memory nightmare. We can now kind of legitimize that to say, you've got to change that interface to adapt it to the cognitive ability of this kid. Like I said, it's a completely different way of going about it, and it's exciting, really exciting.
So would I be wrong, because you mentioned it a couple times, that maybe a lot of this does revolve around accommodations, whether you're self-advocating
It's
or
it's
you're,
fitting the job to your brain, not your brain fitting itself to the job.
yeah. I I I I am a massive fan of making sure that, and I've done it to myself over the years. I equate it to like small business owner just pushing all the accounting off to an accountant, or or the other small business owner, like you said, marketing. Somebody's not good at marketing, or other things that allow you to do your best work. I think the gears stop when we have to do something we don't like to
Yep.
do, we're not good at. I know I've mentioned this 1,000 times. Um, my wife chuckles when we go out to dinner and I have to pull up my iPhone to figure out the tip. I need that.
Yep. Well, so if I may, what this does is it goes way past that. So part of ADHD is visual imagery.
Yeah.
And if you're a small business owner, you have a you know what a website is, and you have a feeling you look for, but you can't picture it in your mind. And as I tell people, it's really hard because if you sit down with a web developer and you tell them what you want, they're going to build it, but it's not always ends up being what you're looking for because you can't really see that in your head. So it begins to legitimize the need to co-engineer, where
Mhm.
you're sitting next to a web developer and they begin to build it, and you're giving minute by minute feedback as it unfolds because you can't think inside your head. You need to think outside your head, and you can't just see it at the end. You begin to understand why you got to sit next to the person and co-engineer it to give feedback because you're not really clear what you're looking for until you see it. Now, that's not something that, like, if you talk to engineers or web designers, they don't necessarily do. But now you can begin to understand inside yourself because cognitive ergonomics is from the inside out. You can begin to validate why you need to do that and give you permission for that accommodation to go forward, as opposed to just sitting there and thinking about doing the website, not getting done, or spending a lot of money and not getting it done. Again, there's lot of really subtle insights that we don't really look at before that begins to explain why we can do it a different way than we did before and why it would work. That's what's really exciting about it.
Yeah. So could I assume that by an adult with ADHD implementing this methodology, obviously with the help of somebody that has been trained and
Yeah, so
uh,
let's put this in context. When you go out into the world, everybody's talking about tips and tricks. Think of that as like an equation, right? E equals MC squared is a great equation, but if you tried to use it on solving for a right triangle, it wouldn't work because you need the Pythagorean theorem.
hmm,
What this program does is it's more like word problems. It trains you to be able to, like word problems, you read a bunch of stuff and you're trying to identify the relevant variables, right? And then you take those variables and you put them in a way so that you can actually solve the problem. In other words, we hated word problems because we had to derive our own equations. What this program does is it helps you, attention scopes helps you identify what the relevant variables are to look for. So now what you can do is you're about deriving your equation for you and the situational variabilities. You're not just guessing at equations, like throwing spaghetti against the wall. I've said, are you drowned? A lot of people come to me, like, are you drowning in tips, tricks, and strategies? Like, yeah, this is a more methodical approach to help you derive an individual equation that's going to work for you.
yeah,
And so it's really about teaching people how to problem solve.
yeah,
It's really exciting.
love it. I love it when people can actually come to the mindset of being a problem solver rather than just a complainer, to be perfectly blunt. Yeah. So cool.
That's really well said.
Yeah. You get to a point where it's like, all right, we've met for a few sessions. We've done a lot of complaining. I get it. You need to get it out of your system. Are you ready to solve some problems? Yeah.
Yep. A few things. Number one, if this makes some sense to you, here's where it won't work. Is if you're the type of person that looks at something and it appears easy and you're not doing it and you're resistant to acknowledge that it's actually, because it's self-evident if you're not doing it, like it's just a phone call. If you're not making the phone call, isn't it self-evident? It's not hard. If emotionally you're not going to let that go, this is not for you because your emotions are getting away. The program is very black and white. It's
Yeah.
very mechanical. It's very much about getting all the emotions out of it. And so I say that because it's not for everybody.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. And the second thing I really want to do is a real plug for you. There's a lot of misinformation out on the internet and social media, and people are selling easy answers that are attractive because that's what people like to buy. And the thing about you, David, is over the years you brought me on and other people because you're really a thought leader in this, and I just want to speak. I'm so grateful for you allowing me to come on and have this kind of conversation because you're not falling into that. And for all your listeners, David is a great resource because he's not just droning on about the simple solutions that don't necessarily work. I mean, they might sound good, but they don't. And I just have to give you a plug for the work that you're doing. And
Yeah,
thank you for
well,
the
yeah,
opportunity.
well, thank you again. I think you and I both love that kind of mechanical approach to
Yep.
to problem solving for busy people with ADHD. So yeah, I think we think alike in that respect. And like I said, there was one, I did a podcast on this. There was some guru out there on social media saying schedule time for procrastination. I'm like, I just want to strangle this guy. I'm like, you have a fundamental misunderstanding of how debilitating
Yep.
procrastination can be for some people, and the stress that but thank you. So it's digcoaching.com, right?
Yep.
People want to connect with you, find out
Yep.
your various things that you do, including this new
Yep.
methodology. So it was great to chat with you again and really dig into the mechanics of the ADHD brain. So
Absolutely.
so
And I
thank
think
you
for
once
the
again.
opportunity.